So just to start us off, the objectives for today's session. Number one, a board decision and vote on whether to move forward with the next phase of the affiliation process. And that phase is really a two-part phase. The first would be the drafting of a letter of intent. And the second would be deeper due diligence following that signing of a letter of intent between Snoqualmie Valley Hospital, the district, and Astria Health. The second objective will depend a bit on the outcome of the first. So depending on the decision, the second objective for today is to agree on the process moving forward in the next phase. Just want to remind everyone, since this is opportunity for some good deep discussion and dialogue today, of the group agreements that you all have agreed to from the start of this engagement. And that is to suspend assumptions, to listen, don't reload, to balance advocacy with inquiry, attribute positive intent, both with your colleagues and your consultants, and that Steve and I will try to tightly facilitate our time together today for a productive endpoint. So this is just a quick reminder of the affiliation engagement process that you all affirmed when you hired Steve and me. And where we are in the process right now is right in between phase 3 and phase 4. So we have obviously issued the RFP. We have had some intents to respond, and then one full response from Astria Health. And we have gone through the process of evaluating that proposal, as well as gathering some additional information. And the current phase gate, if you will, the language that we have been using with you the last couple of sessions is, again, whether to move into this next phase of a letter of intent and a deeper due diligence. So I'm going to let Steve walk through this next section, just a quick recap on the RFP and initial evaluation.
Okay, as Sarah said, what I'd like to do first of all is just recap the RFP that was presented by Astria, and then highlight and primarily, I'd say, focus on some of the financial information, because I think that was probably the area of most significance in the report that Sarah and I provided for you, I guess about a week or so ago. In terms of highlights of the proposal, keep in mind, and this was covered by Astria last evening, but two options: one, a lease purchase option, and then the second being a merger option. And frankly, some of that will depend upon what your bond covenants allow and how that proceeds forward. But there were the two options in there, as you recall, from their proposal. And the other thing, and this gets back to the objectives that you had outlined as commissioners, but addressing the following areas: the revenue bond debt service, which was one of our primary objectives, and as we know, and I think it was reinforced last evening, that there is a commitment to cover through the life of the bonds the debt service. Taxes in excess of the LTGO debt service and the availability of those funds for community benefit. Added capital investment, the ongoing capital investment would be a responsibility, and that's what's covered in their proposal as well. And then the growth in services, scope, size, geography, accountability as it relates to the district and the commissioners, ongoing accountability, and this is focused on the lease option. Frankly, under an ownership option, that's something that it may change a little bit, but there will be a level of accountability throughout the term, regardless of whether it be lease or merger. This may depend upon somewhat the nature of it. The rebranding effort, I think Astria spent a fair amount of time last night talking about the rebranding and why and the benefit and the benefit that would bring to the valley here. And a commitment to the growing local service offerings and partnering with the district on the community health offerings. And again, the level and extent of that is part of what will come out of this due diligence phase and be communicated our expectations through the letter of intent process. And then the $10 million investment that was committed to over a 24-month time period. As I mentioned, in terms of the provisions, the long-term lease with the lease rate equal to debt service through at least 2038. So that is a very long-term commitment to Snoqualmie Valley and its debt service requirements, which again was a significant and primary objective. And then under the merger option, the transfer of assets and liabilities to a new 501c3. And this really becomes more structural. And I think that was not necessarily one of the items that we requested, but it did come back as part of their proposal. So we'll continue to learn more about it and evaluate it as we go forward, if you choose to go forward with the process. Costs and expenses of maintaining leased assets, that again I think was reinforced as a long-term commitment to supporting all the operational as well as capital requirements of Snoqualmie Valley. And capital expenses funded out of operations with the prudent use of debt. And that's what was in their proposal. Again, those types of things, if you choose to go forward, would be negotiated through the letter of intent process and reaching a definitive agreement. So that's not necessarily cast in stone. It's just what had been put forward with the proposal. Other provisions around governance. A new community board established to govern the hospital operations, and as I think it was highlighted, the district board would retain all legally required functions: approval of tax levies, tax increases, sale of district assets. District board would continue to be involved in informing community health offerings, and then the provision of the excess levies beyond amounts needed for district operation and wellness. Pledge to Snoqualmie Valley Hospital operations and capital. I would again point out that all of these items are under negotiation. This is a proposal that if you choose to move forward, these are not cast in stone, but I think it provides a framework and a starting point for your further discussions. Then the commitment to physician recruitment and training. I think again, Astria in their presentation last night certainly highlighted what they have done, what their commitment is, and a very significant opportunity there. And then potential for collaborative opportunities with Puget Sound providers. And as we've discussed, and as Sarah and I had on our report, there's not a lot forthcoming on that front, but I think that naturally would come about as discussions, if you so choose, move further. At this point, that's somewhat sensitive and competitive information and has not been disclosed. Sarah's going to take just a minute and highlight some of the preliminary scoring that was provided before.
Thanks, Steve. So just a quick recap in terms of the initial evaluation that we all conducted on the proposal that was received from Astria Health. So the scoring, just a reminder of the scoring, a 1 was does not meet criteria, a 5 was greatly exceeds, and 3 was sufficiently meets all criteria. And in the initial scoring of the proposal itself, the average scores are listed there in the first column. Is there a pointer on this particular? Is it the middle button? Right to touch it. There we go. So the average scores are here. And then what we did, the commissioners, as you may recall, went through a process of weighting each of the criteria. So in addition to the scores, we actually multiplied by the weights, and then this is actually what the score would need to be if it were to meet all criteria, and the total actual scores are listed here. So essentially the headline here is that based on what you all outlined as your criteria for evaluating the proposal, the commissioners and the executive team and consultants did participate in this evaluation, and the evaluation was quite favorable. With that, Steve's going to take us through the next few slides.
Question? Anybody ask questions along the way?
I don't think so. I'd like to wait until the end if possible. And maybe I should ask the board, what do you all want to do?
Let's finish with the presentation and then ask questions.
Okay.
Happy to answer any questions you have.
So as I mentioned, and you all received our report, in fact, you may have it with you in terms of the summary report. What I'd like to do is focus, first of all, on some of the financial information that was in that report. So what you'll see is, all we've really done is translate directly from your report into some slides, but I'd like to highlight that information for you here. First of all, setting a stage for where did this financial information come from? And the amounts that were set forth in the tables on page 3 of your report are from their Astria Health Certificate of Need filing for the acquisition of Toppenish and Yakima Regional Hospitals. Now, one of the things you may have noted, because I know you have all been out on the various sites and looked at some of the Certificate of Need information, and there's a lot of public information out there. There were 3 different financial scenarios proposed. 2 of them were primarily specific to Certificate of Need regulations that are basically no growth models, and the Department of Health just wants to see basically flatline growth revenues to see how you can respond to that and what the financial results are. And that was a couple of the projection alternatives, financial projection alternatives in the Department of Health data. But there was an alternative C, a scenario C, and if you read through, which I've read the few hundred pages of all the Certificate of Need information and questions and responses and everything else, this particular scenario is a scenario that Astria Health put forward as this is our most likely business model. Now the reason we use these numbers, one, it projects into the future as to what they think the future financial scenario looks like, including the acquisition of Toppenish and Yakima Valley. So it projects out through 2020, and it shows the financial results. The other thing, as I have commented to a few of you, these financial statements have probably been scrutinized more highly than any financial statements in the state, as you know, with 200 respondents to their certificate of need and comments and various other things. So we use these numbers, we use this scenario, and that's the amounts that we used to at least set forward some observations related to the financial position of Astria. Also, as you note in your report, there's 2 different sections. One's the pre-consolidation numbers and then the post-consolidation numbers. Similar to what was in your proposal that you received from Astria, Sunnyside is the pre-consolidation numbers. So before the closing of that transaction, it was just Sunnyside, and you see significant change, but I think that's the reality. Prior to the closing of the acquisition of Toppenish and Yakima Valley, Sunnyside was standalone, but it shows the growth of their system, and it also shows the trend line of what they're doing and where they're going. So I think the pre and post is significant. But we've done that and taken that into consideration in our comments. And then ratio comparison, we did a comparison. We computed a few key ratios, which I will explain to you, for all of the years And then we compared it to two things. One is the statewide average. And these are amounts that were also in the certificate of need filing that the state compares to. And then the other was Moody's all category ratings for what it calls its group of 50 smallest hospitals. But 50 smallest hospitals, the average bed size was still 175 beds or greater. So we thought that was a fair indicator to compare Astria to in terms of an outside indicator. And then I'll provide comment on it as well. We provided an addendum to our report later that related to debt to equity. One of the primary concerns, and I would say it was one of the issues that was raised in the certificate of need process, was that based on those financial projections, the state made a comment that they are fairly highly leveraged, and did Astria have much more additional debt capacity. So we wanted to address that issue with you because by comparative standards, they are highly leveraged, providing they go forward as they discussed issuing debt on the new Sunnyside Hospital. Keep in mind, none of that debt has been incurred at this point. The acquisition debt has, but none of the debt related to Sunnyside. But if they do that, they would have higher debt certainly than they do now. And then the last comment, because we use these numbers that were based upon what they filed with the state, and the state requires kind of a baseline. They don't let you go in and keep changing and updating the numbers. Because the transaction closed about 6 months later than it was originally anticipated, I think we need to keep in mind that their performance now is starting out a little slower against those numbers. Everything probably needs to be pushed off about 6 months in terms of what their actual performance is against those year ends reflected in that report. Okay, so the financial information, and I'll just take you through this so that you can focus on the various categories, but the first three lines, revenue, expense, and net income, and this is what I mentioned before, the pre-consolidation years, 2014 through 2016, the transaction actually closing 9 months into 2017, and then the 3-year projections out through 2020. The first three lines is just a summarized capsule income statement showing revenue, expense, and then the net income for each of these years. And you can see this is the Sunnyside performance, and this is consistent with the numbers that Astria Health provided last evening. Roughly about $7 million a year of income, and as a percentage, as you can see, on 89, almost 90 million, around 8%. We have the numbers in the report, which I'll show you, but this is the percentage of net income to revenue, a strong margin percentage. They continue to project strong performance through the next few years, and this is now doing the same type of turnaround that they did with Sunnyside, anticipating a similar type of turnaround with the performance of Yakima Valley and Toppenish. So they show about $30 million net income on a net revenue base of $273 million. Just to point out, you can see interest expense continues to grow. This is, and again, it's probably been put off a little bit because of the timing of the closing of the transaction, but it starts to build as they issue debt here related to the debt associated with the transaction, and there was debt that was disclosed in the certificate of need around the Yakima Valley and Toppenish transaction. And then the further debt, and you'll see that down here, they continue to add debt over a few years, and that's the $120 million related to the Sunnyside new hospital construction. And so you see interest expense going up accordingly with those increases in debt. Depreciation, the same type of thing. Depreciation is highlighted because it has a major impact on cash flow. Depreciation is one of those expenses that you don't have to write a check for. So to the extent that it's in your revenue base, you actually generate cash flow from that added depreciation, and you'll see that as it contributes to the increase in cash flow. But you can see depreciation grows, and that's basically when this new Sunnyside Hospital would come online in these out years. You see cash balances growing from 22 million up to building steadily, mainly because of the increased income and the building depreciation. You see cash balances growing up to $140 million. I highlighted the debt before, and then you see equity continuing to build from the profitability from the combined operations of the new entity. Now, also in your report, but just wanted to highlight this for you here as well, I mentioned excess margin. That is the percentage of the net income that I showed you divided by the net revenue. And I had mentioned back here, I think I said around 8% back here. And so Sunnyside, strong operating performance, and that continues to build as they move forward. You can see any of these indicators are certainly higher than the Moody's average rate. We were not able to get the statewide average rate because that was not disclosed in the certificate of need, but I can assure you the statewide average rate will be much more in line with Moody's than it would be at this performance level in terms of excess margin. Debt to equity, and I will go back because this is also one of the things, as I mentioned, as we put in our addendum, debt to equity of some other hospitals in the state. But going back to this slide, if you take the amount of debt and the amount of equity, so we can all relate to debt. You know, if you have a house and it's worth $1 million, I wouldn't say 100,000. There's no houses worth 100,000 anymore. But let's say your house is worth $1 million, and you have a $250,000 mortgage. You would have a 0.25 or 25% mortgage on the value of that house at $100,000. So similarly, if you're to say, if I have $7 million of debt and I've got equity that has built up, just like you would have equity in a home, what is the relationship of my debt to the equity that I have built up in my home? And you can see here, certainly lower than 1, and I'll take you back to the percentages on all these. But you see as they add debt, the debt actually, you know, here it's 10 million on 45 million. And then as they start adding the transaction debt and then the Sunnyside Hospital debt, it gets higher. It grows much faster than equity grows, and it's at a factor of greater than 1, the relationship of debt to equity. And so this is when debt to equity becomes a factor of 1 or greater. And that's what we see here. You see debt to equity as soon as they start adding from the transaction closing and the building of the hospital, it gets as high as 1.5 times, and then it levels off at that point and starts going down because they don't add any more debt, but they're continuing to be profitable. They continue to build equity, and it comes down, there we go. And it comes down to about 1.21. Now, what I commented, and in our report when we say they're highly leveraged, you can see the statewide average is like 0.41, the Moody's average is like 0.468. So relative to those statewide averages, they certainly are more highly leveraged. But one of the things that we looked at, we said, well, what about other hospitals? And so this was when we came back and said, well, let's provide you some additional information. And let's just assume that we take the benchmark that if you have more than a factor of 1 times the amount of debt as you have equity, so that's why all of these show a factor of 1 or greater. What are some of the hospitals in the state that have a factor of greater than 1 in terms of that relationship to debt to equity? You see Swedish First Hill, the big hospital downtown, is roughly they have as much debt as they have equity. It's a 1.02 times factor. You see Swedish Edmonds, 1.15. Swedish Issaquah, obviously a very new hospital, brand new hospital. It has 3 times as much debt as it has equity. Virginia Mason, 1.13. Now Trios and Kennewick, 5.2. And when your debt to equity gets to that point, you get a special footnote because they essentially declared bankruptcy. And they're working through that currently, but they were very highly leveraged in that regard. And then as you look at some of the others, but by comparison, looking at these hospitals, it puts the Astria relationship much more in line and says, well, obviously if it peaks at that level and it comes down at the rate that it is, that's really not too far out of line with certainly many of the other hospitals that we see in the state. And then the one note here that, as you know, many of these are parts of other systems. And this is the individual hospital system because this is information that is presented and is presented by hospital, not by system, to the Department of Health. But they look at their credit overall as a system. So we're looking at the relationships of individual hospitals, but as they're looking at their overall creditworthiness, they would look to the strength of the system for any of these that are part of the system. The other thing I'd like to point out in the last line really, so we've talked about debt to equity. Debt service coverage is another indicator that is in the certificate of need, and it wasn't really that remarkable. It shows strong debt service coverage and certainly in line with the statewide and Moody's benchmarks. Days cash on hand, 143 days, and this was Sunnyside standalone before they started making more and more of the investment in their system and in recruitment and various other things. So it went as high as 143 days. I think if you were to talk to the Astria management team, they would say when they first took over management of Sunnyside, that at one point was almost less than 10 days of cash. So with the operation turnaround that they did, the amounts built pretty good. And then post-consolidation, one of the things that brings this down, and it's in our footnotes as well, when they did the transaction with Yakima Valley and the Toppenish, because they were owned by a for-profit company, all of the cash was being swept to the for-profit company. So when they closed the deal at the end of September and started over, they had to build cash from there, and that's where it goes down to this 65 days and then builds from there. And you can see it builds up to as much as 234 days. Oh, excuse me. That's right. That's the Moody's value. 211. So I think with that, I'd just like to touch on a few of the observations from the report that we provided you. And again, these are in your report. Some of this I've already touched on briefly, but the cash balances being low in 2016, 2017, related to the low starting point post-closing of the transaction. Revenue growth based upon physician recruitment and investment in new equipment, clinical services. Excuse me. All of this information is disclosed in the certificate of need, and it describes the recruiting and the much of what was shared with you last evening about the increase in services and the increase in physicians. A strong history of financial performance and hospital turnarounds. And I say that because there's no question Astria is a new organization. And there's no question if you look at those projections and say, what's the basis for them to be able to say that we can achieve this? The best observation is the track record that they have currently, but you're counting on them to be able to do that again and again to achieve those projected results. But they certainly have done that with their experience with Sunnyside. All of that is translated into above margins. And then, excuse me, the post-consolidation, the accumulation of cash and equity, and then, as we had mentioned and spent some time talking about, the debt to equity ratios are high, but start coming more in line with industry standards once the amount of that debt peaks out. And as you can imagine, when you build a new hospital at $120 million, you issue debt up front and you don't incur the debt, you start paying it down and you start building equity, and that ratio comes into line pretty fast after you've issued all the debt to build a facility. We talked about service line expansion. And just in the highlights, and this is just the overall comments that we had for you as we looked at Astria overall, they are a new organization, and these growth plans could create future financial uncertainty. I think, as was shared with you, it's exciting to be a part of something that's new and growing and dynamic, but with that comes a certain level of uncertainty that we should all acknowledge. And then we had talked before about, although we don't know about key partnerships, but the ability to achieve the anticipated market growth is dependent upon that. And certainly the investment in surgical services, again, that's something that will have to be focused on and dealt with as you go forward, if you choose to do so and move into the next phases of this project. The comment around days cash, although it grows very rapidly and mechanically, we understand why it grows because they're very profitable, and as the depreciation level builds, it allows for the generation of more cash flow. But I think we would just caution you that as a new organization and an organization focused on growth, that may be somewhat optimistic because, not for bad reasons, most likely that cash would be used for good business purposes. But I think if you were to look out to 2020, you may find that that could be optimistic, that they would actually be at 210 days of cash. And then again, we certainly talked about the debt to equity being impacted by the Sunnyside Hospital. So I think with that, I guess it's you, Sarah. I don't recognize that slide, so it must be Sarah's.
Before we get to this point, I really think we
Yeah.
I think that's appropriate. The other commissioners ready to ask some questions? So are you essentially done with your presentation?
Well, then we're going to move into the discussion of this next phase and the vote. But yes.
deal with the first
Yeah,
phase.
I think that's...
Sure.
Who would like to ask the first question?
I'd like to comment that it would have been nice with respect to consultant observations if you had done the same thing for Snoqualmie Hospital. So that you balance this. What is the need for us acting so quickly before the public knows what's going on? My understanding of Mr. Stryker's, I'm sorry he's not here, is that we could continue as is for 3 years, no change, except perhaps a little attempts to save money here and there, but really no change for 3 years. What is the rush? And I'm sorry you didn't give us consultant observation on the need to affiliate so quickly with anyone.
Go ahead. I believe we determined that when we did our strategic planning, that we, as a board, determined that. Yeah, I think we did.
Well,
Regardless.
the other difference is
Do you want to address
So,
that?
I mean, my answer was going to be somewhat similar. Our understanding from the RFP you put out for the consulting engagement was that you all had already reached the decision that you wanted to pursue an affiliation, and then further when we came to meet with you the first time, the clear message we received is that you were hoping to have a rather expeditious process. So that's what we have been attempting to facilitate.
And also, Commissioner Pollard, I heard from David, he will be here shortly, so he had it scheduled for 1 o'clock, so that he is on his way. So that might help too. All right, any other questions?
I would just, Commissioner Pollard, would you like further?
well,
Commissioner
if
Pollard.
you want to continue answering that question, that's fine, of course.
I was just going to add a couple of other comments around that. I think as you look at Snoqualmie Valley, and I guess we weren't asked to put it side by side, and that's maybe a failure on our part to respond to what would be helpful for you. But I think if you look at your current margin, you're basically at a break-even margin level. And if you look at your days cash, you look at the ratios that we put up there, you don't come close to any of those levels of performance. And you may very well have 3 years that you could operate at the level that you're at, but I think there's risk with that. And I think as you've chosen to go down this path, as you've decided to, I think once you start down that path, you want to see it through and see, you know, again, if you can find the appropriate partner that would meet the critical objectives and very high objectives that you've set, you have to evaluate and say, okay, are we ready to go forward with that or not? And if for any reason that isn't available to you, you may decide that you would go forward on your own.
Madam President, may I make a comment on that topic as well?
You may.
Thank you. In our strategic planning process, and you weren't there, but you saw the results of that, we indicated that affiliation was one of the high priority strategies for the organization. And we talked about how starting that process now, rather than at some point, at some point in the future where we may be struggling financially, has an advantage. What you see often in the hospital industry is mergers born out of panic. And we talked about that. And we didn't want to be one of those hospitals that was on the ropes and seeking a partner with zero leverage in those conversations. We have a beautiful new facility. We've done some really tough things over the last 12 to 18 months with respect to efficiency gains. We have positive cash flow. We're adding, putting money in the account. I agree we don't have those ratios, but we've put ourselves in a position where we actually have something to offer in a partnership. And that was part of the rationale in strategic planning for engaging in this process now rather than potentially at some future point where we don't have as much to offer, much less leverage. Thank you.
Pardon me, President, but the video graphers here have asked that the commissioners make sure their mics are on, hold a little bit closer to you so they can hear you. So, Commissioner Hall, they were not able to capture some of your
I'm sorry,
So just to remind you that they're trying to pick that up. Thank you.
I think at this point, I'm going to turn this over to our legal counsel and let him moderate as we ask questions.
All right, so I think Commissioner Paul had a follow-up question.
Well, yes, I think the key words were appropriate affiliate, our merger partner. And that's what we're trying to deal with here. Last night, we were barraged with 5 members of the program staff, 88 slides, at the end, a packet of information. The point is, this district is owned by the people. The people need to know what's going on. You say that we don't want to act in a panic. I say we're acting in a panic. I want to see this discussion come out in the valid record and in other ways to let the people know what's going on and give them a chance to react and reply and express their concerns before we take the precipitous step of drafting a letter of intent. That we did that earlier with overlay, and it caused many problems, and it really led to the departure of our previous superintendent. So let's not make that mistake again. Let's not force this into a premature LOI until we had a chance to read those 88 slides. They were on the screen usually for less than 30 seconds, and we could hardly read them, so much detail. And then the presentation was quickly spoken.
Commissioner Pollard, do you have a question?
I'm finishing my point, please. And therefore, all I'm saying is, before pushing ahead with a premature LOI, let's see the report and the valid record and other ways that the public can know what's going on, because that's a precipitous step.
Can I make a comment? Not a question, but a comment.
Well, I'm going to make sure the question is answered.
Yeah, so at this point, because we have a presentation, and now is the opportunity, as we did last night, where there would be question and answer opportunity. and then we would come back to Commissioner Pollard and Commissioner Herron and make your comments, and that's more of a discussion phase, where you're speaking and providing your impressions, your suggestions or concerns. But at this point, I think we want to give the benefit to the consultants to answer any questions that you might have as to their presentation.
I thought my question was, what's the rush?
Well, I think I can ask that. That's a pretty good question, but I missed it, and I apologize. There was a long preface to that before I missed the question.
So this is a complex issue, and sometimes you can't ask the question in 3 words.
Oh, absolutely, understood. So I think the question then to the consultants, Sarah and Steve, would be from Commissioner Pollard, what is the rush?
So I believe we actually just answered that it was our understanding you all had already reached the decision to pursue an affiliation, and it was communicated in the RFP for the consultant engagement that you wished for it to be a rather tight process. So, but what I would like to say, just based on some of your additional comments, is having been through many of these sorts of transactions in the past, this one is highly unusual. And the reason is that it's been a very public process. And so what would typically happen at this juncture is actually right after you selected a finalist, there would be a signing of what's called a non-disclosure agreement. And the signing of that agreement would enable both parties to feel very comfortable sharing a lot of data and a lot of information. Perhaps not all of the information they would in a formal due diligence process, but quite a bit more than what it is we've been able to share at this point. So when we get to these next few slides, after you all we've answered your questions, what we'd like to suggest is that in this next phase of the process, we would be doing a much deeper due diligence. And that without taking that next step, we probably won't have the benefit of any more information than what it is you heard last night.
Before we move on, I'd like to state for the record that Commissioner Spikers is here and has been here for about the last 5-8 minutes.
I apologize. I had this down at 1 o'clock. I was in court until actually noon in Seattle. So I got back to the office thinking I had plenty of time, and I'm getting, of course, I don't email while I'm driving, so I got your texts and everything. And I got back to the office, I'm reading the text. I go, what? Sorry, I apologize.
Welcome, Commissioner Spikers. So Secretary Spikers, the consultants have gone through the proposal review and initial information gathering. They've also prepared slides that go in front of you. At this point, we're still asking questions. So Commissioner Pollard, I'll go down the line and then ask additional questions and come back. Commissioner Herron, any questions of the consultants?
Just to follow up on the rush definition, and for the sake of the public, would you please let the public know when this whole process started so that we are not in this definition of being rushed? The timeline that we've been going through, all the meetings, the work study, the special sessions, I'd like the public to know that we've been through that whole process.
Sure.
Thank you.
So my recollection is that we responded to the RFP for consulting services back in the late 2016, and that we commenced discussions with you all in February. I believe our first work study session was in May. We'll have to go back and just double check the exact timeline, but we have been working on this with you all for several months.
I could comment a little bit more on that.
We're in question and answers right now, but I think that would be helpful to provide additional information. Secretary Spikers.
I'm a little out of order, but I have a good memory about when this process started. It was, and all of the commissioners here, except for maybe Commissioner, because she was not part of the board at the time, but we were in yes, Commissioner Herron was not there, but in October or November 2014, all of the it was 2014, the board all unanimously decided that affiliation was something that the board wanted to do. And September of 2015, we had a strategy workshop, and we all unanimously again agreed that that is what we wanted to do. Since that time period, we have had at least a dozen open hearing meetings concerning affiliation. This is not a rush, but we've been actually using a lot of diligence in our planning process, and we're not throwing things on the wall to decide whether they stick or not. This has been a very thoughtful, carefully process, and it surprises me that anyone is saying that we're rushing.
Speakers, I'm going to, as your parliamentarian, ask you to hold your comments to answer that question. You provided additional information that's beneficial to your board. As to your personal comments and impressions, those will come later. All right, we're going to continue to go down the line now. Commissioner Spiker, Secretary Spiker, do you have any questions of the consultants? I know you didn't have the benefit of seeing a
Well, I
presentation.
reviewed the report thoroughly a couple of times, and I did have some questions that I thought, if we were to continue with this process, there's a period of time we have to exercise our diligence in looking at everything to see if this is the proper fit. It appears from the presentation, maybe it could be. Obviously, we're not even close to deciding at this point. So if we go through a letter of intent, this is not a binding agreement or anything like that. Right? The only thing that would be binding is a confidentiality issue, right?
So that's actually content that's in the next portion of our presentation, which I can.
Well, you can save that, and I'll ask a different question.
Okay.
That's okay.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, right now I think what we're doing is the slides we covered were direct from the report.
okay, then I'm looking at the report, the financial ratios, and then I go down to the debt over equity. I think you plugged that in, some of the other hospitals that began. I'm kind of surprised that, this is, where did you get this information from?
That is directly out of the Department of Health database. Every hospital in the state is required to report to the Department of Health annually. And it's I just took their collective report that shows each of the hospitals, their debt, their equity. I just looked down and said, which hospitals in the state? It wasn't picking out any particular hospitals. I just said, any of them that have a factor of greater than 1 in terms of the amount of debt to equity, I'll list them. So that's essentially all of the hospitals in the state of that nature.
So, Commissioner Secretary Spiker speaking, page 6 of 6, called the addendum of the consultant's report, and it also can be found on slide 15 of the presentation that was done. You'll note at the bottom it says source DOH database.
Slides aren't in hand yet.
Okay.
Just finalized.
Got it.
Does the public have a copy of this addendum?
No, they don't yet. This is just being provided to the board today, and the slides have not yet been distributed or copied. I was just referencing when you hit the slides, it's slide number 5, and it's in your report on page 6.
Thank you.
So just one comment, because of your surprise, I think the footnote is really important. About 2/3 of these individual hospitals are part of larger systems. And it's really the larger system performance overall that is most important when those organizations are coming forward for their bond ratings and their reviews.
Did I answer your question, Secretary Spikers?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And Vice President Young.
The one question I have is probably answered. If we go forward with the letter of intent, how binding is that?
So how about if we come back to that right after the next segment of the presentation?
That'll be the next presentation.
I'm sorry.
President Norris.
The only question I have, and I think you answered it, Steve, is when the cash flow goes down, is that due to, and it was in 2016-17, was that due to recruitment and treatment and new equipment and clinical services that they acquired? Is that why their ratio changed?
It's my understanding it was. When they first took over control of Sunnyside, the new management, they turned around operations, generated cash, and as they started investing that, because as you know, they shared the 44 additional services and the number of physicians that they recruited. Some of that cash flow went to cover that additional investment in their health system.
That's what I wanted to cover. Thanks.
CEO Parker.
Could you go to the slide that showed the P&L plus the, that one, yeah. That one. This is just a point of clarification and just so that everybody's clear. Could you confirm that when we look at the net income line, that net income does not decrease by the two items below it? Interest expense and depreciation. Those interest
Correct.
Expense and depreciation expense are already factored into
They are in
the
this
expense
line, in the expense
It's
line.
just showing
Yes.
some detail of the
Yes.
expense line, correct?
It's just showing the variation because they're a function of debt.
And there's, yeah, okay. I just wanted to make sure that we all understood that net income, that
Yeah.
line is solid, and you wouldn't want to reduce that line by the interest expense and depreciation lines because they've already been taken out in
Excellent point.
the total expense line.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Pollard.
Go back, if you would, to the appendix slide. With respect to Trios Kennywood Hospital, I'd just like to point out that you used the term, they filed for bankruptcy. And bankruptcy is a pretty scary term. But what this is, Chapter 9, is to allow public organizations, cities,
Sure.
municipal districts, and so on, to restructure their debt. It's important to note that Kennywood is continuing operations as if nothing had happened, but now they're in the process of restructuring their debt, which may be reducing some of the attempt by one of the commissioners to say, well, we've got 3 years and then we have to close our doors. That's not what
So, Commissioner Pollard, again, I apologize for interrupting, but
Yeah.
I must be a question here somewhere.
The question is it true that Chapter 9 is a way to restructure debt? It is not what we commonly think of as bankruptcy.
I agree with you, and I think as you read the footnote, it says it's said under the protection of Chapter 9.
Yes, I agree with that.
It is a filing of bankruptcy, so that the creditors cannot collect on the debts until the restructuring is completed and approved by bankruptcy court. So it is a filing of bankruptcy, but you're correct, it's restructuring or reorganization.
And it's not, isn't it true that it's not a situation where a hospital would just shut its doors? In the example of Kennewick, they're operating as normal.
Correct.
As if nothing
They would have
happened.
the option if they wanted to shut their doors, but apparently they are not doing that. And then Commissioner Herron.
Could we go back to the income statement slide, please? Just for clarification, I would like to know, I see that the numbers dramatically increases from 2016 pre-consolidation times and 2017. Now, the post-consolidation between 2018 2020, are those actual numbers or are they just not actual because we're still, it's financial forecasting? Where do you get those numbers to continue to increase?
Oh, why do they continue to increase?
Yeah, impressive. It's
Yeah.
impressive numbers.
It is the anticipation by management that they can perform the same type of turnaround with Yakima Valley and Toppenish as they did with Sunnyside. And that's what's reflected in that higher performance. Plus, as you know, it's a much larger system at that point. As they said, Yakima Valley, or I guess we have Astria Regional, is by far a much larger facility than is Sunnyside.
Okay. It's a great scenario. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Secretary Spiker.
Thank you.
You were at the meeting last night, but I'm going to ask you to tell me whether this report reflects what some of the representations that were made yesterday. One of the things that I heard was that if they were to do any kind of a affiliation process, take over operations, that there would be a lot of communication. Employees would want to keep the employees, that's my understanding. and they would also want to grab all of our skills concerning this swing bet program, because I think we have the best here. So based on your review of and analysis, it's not really in this report, but do you think that that would be an accurate representation of what they did?
I would say yes, and in our follow-up Q&A and our calls and additional information gathering, we did ask some specific questions along those lines, and the answers last night, what they provided in their presentation last night was consistent with their answers to us. So I think their commitment is real on those two fronts.
And the only thing I would add to that, Commissioner Spikers, is obviously the certificate of need numbers were based upon that market. And what they shared with us last night, what they would do in this market would be different. I think they probably were doing more turnaround efforts in that market with probably less market growth potential, where I think here the investments would be different to take advantage of a very favorable market. And so to perform at the same level, but it would be for some different reasons.
Secretary Spikers, that answer your question?
I think so. I was more concerned about what they would do with the employees, I guess. That was my main concern. Is that what they were representing?
I believe that was the intent when he answered that question last night. What I'm basing that on is both what was provided in the proposal, and the proposal did in fact state that both the executive team and the employees in good standing, the expectation would be that they would continue on. Obviously ongoing performance being a requirement.
Vice President Young.
I'm just listening.
Thank you. President Norris.
I have a question on the addendum, I'm gonna say this wrong, addendum, that how come, we've got Swedish Issaquah, and their debt to, their ratio is pretty bad, and they are close. I guess what I wanna know is, why do you think that is? And if we bring in another entity, how are they gonna be able to combat that? I mean, if it's that close to here, and we've talked about getting to Swedish really easily, what will they do different so that we don't look like Swedish in that debt to equity?
Well, as we said, I think this really reinforces the significance. They are borrowing on the credit of a massive health system. So this is reported to the state because the state doesn't care how big of a system you're part of. They want to see financial statements and financial performance for individual hospitals. And as you can imagine, and I think Sunnyside would be a good example, if you borrow most of that $120 million to build a hospital, you're going to have very high debt relative to the equity. But as I said, you borrow that all on day one, and then your financial performance improves over the next 15 or 20 years, and you very much come back in line. So Swedish, as you would imagine, is a brand new hospital. It wasn't an incremental build out, of an existing hospital. Swedish Issaquah is a brand new hospital. That's why you would have very high debt to equity, but they're not borrowing on their own by any means. And so the financial resources are of a much broader system.
But isn't Swedish a fairly large system also, including Swedish in Issaquah, or Everett?
Sure, and as you can imagine, it all rolls up through the Swedish system and then into the Providence system.
Yeah, probably.
And they actually borrow at that highest level for their creditworthiness.
Okay, thank you.
CEO Parker.
Thank you. I'm going to try and put this in the form of a question, but on one of your slides you talked about the tax revenue in excess of service of LTGO bonds. And are you still reading it the way I do in their proposal that that excess would be used? It says excess levy funds beyond what the district needs for operation of the district. So the district would continue to have operating costs and for its wellness activities. And what I'm hearing from them in that is that there is an understanding that the district continues in a role of providing health and wellness services to the community, and that the LTGO, excess of LTGO tax funds could be used for that purpose.
That's referenced on slide 8, where CEO Parker talked about the excess levy beyond amounts used for district operations and wellness activities.
Yeah, so I guess my answer to that question is.
Well, you did say wellness. I'm sorry, I missed that.
Yeah.
You did mention that.
I apologize.
So this particular sub-bullet point that you're referring to really comes straight from their proposal.
Yeah.
They didn't speak in a lot of detail about it last night. I think they, covered it fairly quickly.
This is on me. I'm sorry. You did put wellness activities in the slide, and I missed it during your presentation, so I apologize.
Thank you. Commissioner Paul.
Before I ask my question, can I get a legal opinion on the issue of whether non-disclosure agreement or confidentiality agreement in the LOI is possible where we have the Public Records Act and the Open Public Meetings Act and so forth. I question whether that may be fine for a private organization, but I think under the ERA, all of this would have to be public. Is that right?
I think that's what Sarah was referencing, is her familiarity is with non-disclosure agreements, whereas she called this an extraordinary approach or a unique approach, that you cannot have specific non-disclosure agreements because of the Public Records Act and Open Public Meeting Act and other requirements. So I can't give you a specific answer until I see a specific question, but it would be unlikely to have a full non-disclosure agreement or confidentiality agreement to go forward, except for during the terms of the negotiation, because at that point it's still a work product and hasn't been discussed outside a closed arena.
Thank you for that legal clarification. I do have a question with respect to the CON, which you mentioned in your report. That is the certificate of need that regional of Yakima got by the two hospitals. Regional having been formed only in December of 2016. It appears you were saying that there was no problem whatever if it was granted and so on. But as I mentioned last night, the newspaper over there said, state says yes, but. And I tried to find out what the but was, and the newspaper tried to find out what were the conditions. And the conditions should be public knowledge, and I believe they are now if we could get the ERA request to the Department of Health. Did you look at the conditions under which the CON was granted? Because those were supposed to be disclosed within 30 days and by now.
Commissioner Pollard, based on your comment last night, the first thing I did when I got up this morning was go find those. And I have copies here for you. And my assessment was that management last night, they were fairly accurate. They're fairly inconsequential. I think there's I'll give you a copy. There's probably 15 or 20 items. But as I read through them all again, I did not see anything that was, overly restrictive to them in any way. But like I say, I have a copy. I'd be more happy to share it with you. But they've been available for some time. They were actually, it's the Department of Health's response to Mr. Gallagher. And they were published just through the process. And I believe they were available right away out on the Department of Health website. So, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Herron.
Okay, on the addendum that you listed all the hospitals with their debt to equity ratio, I find it very interesting, but not too many critical access hospitals was listed. I would like to see how we compare in terms of debt to equity ratio among the rest of the 37 CA hospitals in the state. Because it looks like most of them are like private, nonprofit hospitals. So there's only one that I think Valley Medical is a public, I believe, but not many of them. So I would like to see,
The
We
ratio,
provide that.
equity
I think that would have to be a next step.
Okay, and just to follow up, how did you come up with just this, the names of this hospitals? What made you-
As I mentioned, I went through the entire state database, and my criteria is which hospitals in the state have a debt-to-equity factor of greater than 1.
Okay, all right, thank you.
And regardless of size, type of hospital, but we can certainly pull out the critical access hospitals from that same database and show you that information.
Thank you.
Secretary Spiker?
Yes, now we're paying you to do this, of course, and so, we're also relying on your expertise, because I don't think any of us have the background you do, that's why we hired you. I'm looking at a lot of, I'm looking at, again, page 3 of 6, it's the chart with the income statement and balance sheet items. And I look at that, and based on one of the things I think I would comment on, I guess, is the net income turnaround from 16 to 17. Also, the revenue turnaround from 16 to 17. I believe there's been a comment that they took over after this turnaround. Can you kind of give us a time frame on that, whether that's accurate?
I believe the current management took over Sunnyside, what did they say, 2012 or so, and started that process because I know Sunnyside was in pretty difficult financial position. And 2014, 15, and 16, in fact, I think I have it in my notes. As you recall from last night, they showed a graph. The first year was like a $4.5 million loss, I think in 2012, and then these current years of Sunnyside at about $7 million. That's a significant turnaround. And if, I guess I would say the financial performance you see there, and I think maybe to address your question, if that was standard and every hospital in the state was making a 10% margin, we'd be having them run every hospital in the state. I mean, that's outstanding performance. But I think they've demonstrated they could do it with Sunnyside. What they have built into the projections through 2020 is they very much anticipate that doing that with the new system, with Yakima Valley and with Toppenish. And that's what that reflects. Now, I would comment that these financial statements were the financial statements that were in the certificate of need. And they did receive a very high level of scrutiny. And there were certainly a number of organizations that challenged those numbers as well and said, these seem very aggressive. But management came back with rebuttal to the state, and you can see in the conditions, or certainly in the comments that the state made, they certainly didn't question this financial performance as being overly aggressive or unreasonable. And I don't, but none of us can see the future, and I think our comments to you would be, that's a very high level of performance to achieve a 10% operating margin. And the only thing that we would have to go on to support those comments is they certainly have done it historically with Sunnyside. That's part of getting to know management more if you choose to move forward through this process, and I think challenge that more.
Thank you.
Vice President Young. President North.
I had a thought when I was listening so closely to what he said. I guess I do have a comment that this stuff is online, and when we started talking about this company coming to partner with us, and when they gave us, that's one of the things I did, was I got on Department of Public Health, and I saw the certificate of need, and I saw a lot of these documents. So I think in preparations for us, that we should be willing to take some time and look up, instead of just letting our consultants do it all, we can look this information up. And I know Commissioner Pollard has done some of that as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead.
And I guess I do have a question, in that Swedish is a part of a much larger system, yet there's a part of Swedish is not doing well. So I guess, do we have, it's the ratio debt, that when we're talking money, that it's not as good as I would like to see it. So what is gonna help us, when you read this and you look at their presentation, what is gonna help us to be able to surpass Swedish and to be able to, and I know they're a build it and they will come, Astria is that way, but what do we have so we know that we have an opportunity and that we actually, it's viable for us to be able to be successful, like what we're seeing?
Well, so a couple of things. Steve can expand on this first piece that I'm going to say. Debt to equity is one ratio. I suspect that if he dug deeper into the operating performance of Swedish Issaquah, you'd see some pretty good numbers. So that is one ratio, and we targeted that ratio to do some of these benchmarks for you just because that was a particular concern that came up. Would that be accurate?
Well, that information is in the Department of Health database as well, and I think if you just look at Swedish Issaquah, they have an operating loss, as you would expect, and as you said, it's a very large hospital that the occupancy isn't quite there. But I think it's very difficult to compare that because, again, they have, they're in a growth market, they have a backing of a very substantial system, and they're not out there on their own, operating on their own. So I think it's a very hard comparison to make.
The second part of your question, though, I think what is different about here, I think one of the things that you heard last night and one of the reasons why Astria sees this as a great opportunity, Jody came and sort of recapped some of the highlights of the market assessment that we went through a couple of months ago with you. This is a really strong growth market, and there are a number of services that you can see people are now leaving the community to get that you don't actually even currently offer, or what you do offer is fairly limited in scope. And so those opportunities are pretty ripe for some additional growth. So I think it's the view that this is a growth market, and to me, that's why an organization would be willing to step up to that kind of debt, is that they're hedging their bets that they can see quite a bit of growth and make it worth their while.
Thank you.
CEO Park.
Thank you.
All right. Commissioner Baldwin.
The proposal from, at that time, Regional Health Yakima, and by the way, in December, they applied for a trademark with that. Now, within the last 2 weeks, their brand has changed. But the point is, they have not existed as an organization except since December of 2016. In other words, very short period to determine their financial ability as an organization. And they provided us with a lot of data about Sunnyside and the individual hospitals and the 15 to 20 services that they affiliated with and so forth. But what is the financial situation of Regional Health Yakima when they provide, that's the name in the proposal, or what's the name of it now? It's hard to remember. Astria, or Atria, isn't it?
Astria.
All right. What is the financial situation of the parent organization, not the individual components? I don't think we have enough information. There's such a new kid on the block as an organization.
I don't think we have any indication of the parent apart from the individual hospitals. And as you pointed out, it is a very new organization. And I think that's part of the further questions that you'll need to ask to get comfortable with that. I mean, there's some very dynamic aspects of it. There's some solid history to base what they've projected forward, to base that on. But I think that's part of the process, is to get a better understanding of how is that going to come about.
Commissioner Herring.
Is it not true that when, let's say, regardless of the newness of the organization, that when you apply to get your certification and all that, even with all the consultants, they look at financial documentation, correct?
Sure, it's available out there, the individual performance.
Right, so they don't look at just because you are new, that you don't have the ability or the capability to move forward, is that right?
Well, and I think as that was part of our objective in having management come and meet with you.
Okay.
Part of what goes into your assessment is, do we believe that this management team can do what they said they would do? And as you can tell, they're a pretty seasoned group of professionals, and then it becomes a matter of, this is what they've said, how do they execute against that? And so I don't think it's a matter of saying, well, this is a 2-year-old organization with a 2-year-old management team. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just maybe one more comment, since I was part of the health system for 12 years, and actually about 15 if you count my years with Providence before that. A big part of them becoming a system is to gain and achieve some efficiencies through that systemness. So they had a couple of slides last night that they shared with you on shared services and things like group purchasing, things like IT and EHR, things like financial services. Those sorts of things spread across a system can actually result in much greater efficiencies for the individual entities. So that's the whole sort of value proposition of becoming more of an operating company.
Secretary Spikers. Thank you. Vice President Young.
Well, I guess I have a question. Can we go forward with your presentation to find out more about what the next steps involve?
I think that is the next question and the next step, once we resolve these questions as to the presentation they've made thus far. Any further questions as to the presentation made thus far?
Point of clarification, the term slides was used, and as I understand it, we now have the slides from last night. So I think you were stating that we don't have the slides from this presentation today. Is that how the term was used?
That's right.
But we will be getting the slides from today.
And all be posted as well
Posted where?
on our website.
All right, thank you.
Yeah,
I have more questions, but since it appears that we're at the point now that we need to move on.
well, before moving on, if you have a question that should get answered, I think it's appropriate to ask it then.
Well, you mentioned before that there are questions about the presentation, and then there would be an opportunity for us to express concerns and opinions. When would that occur?
Well, that would occur after our consultants are done with their presentation, so that we're not interrupting and using some of that valuable time for question and answer. And then you'd be able to, in the form of a debate, provide your opinions and impressions.
There was one point that you made that was very concerning, and correct me if I'm wrong. Sometimes last night's meeting was one meeting, today's meeting, I know it was addressed at some point. And that is this idea that our existing board, under I think both scenarios, would have its influence and authority reduced, diminished, or actually eliminated in terms of policy. That the board would then become just a body that would sign checks and process the taxes and all of that sort of thing. That the policy would go to a now-elected group of people, and it wasn't clear how those would be appointed. But the point is they would not be elected and accountable to the people. Is that correct?
Yes, it's correct. And I think there's further room for definition of what role the board may want to play in terms of ensuring continuation of some community health activities and wellness activities and things that you've expressed an interest in and regional has responded to. But the crux of this is that you have put forward in your RFP that you are looking for a partner organization that is willing to take on quite an extraordinary amount of debt in your revenue bonds. In exchange, they need to have accountability and responsibility for the operations of this hospital and for assuring realization of the growth strategies, some of which they began to describe to you last night, more of which will come to fruition the rest of this process. So yes, in effect, you would be turning over governance of the operations to a new community board. Really, the way it was described last night, the Astria Health System Board has the reserve powers. Certain powers are delegated to the local community board. So a new community board would be formed here. What they stated in their proposal was that they would very much like to have the input of the existing district board and commissioners and community in terms of who might be on that board. But typically community boards are appointed.
Thank you. And Commissioner Herron, and we'll move right down the line.
On that same line, if let's say the model that we are going to apply is the lease purchase, okay, we have Astria operating the hospital, and there's the CEO. Who do they answer to? If they are, who do they report to? Who's their boss? Who's their board?
Who is named, Commissioner, when you're saying?
When I say they, this is Astria Health, there's got to be somebody up here, correct? Who is it?
So my understanding of their current configuration is that John Gallagher is accountable to the Astria Health System Board. In the same way, the CEO of the new Snoqualmie Valley, Astria Snoqualmie Valley, or whatever it would be called, would have some accountability to the board and also to the system CEO, probably a direct line to the system CEO, but I don't think we have enough details in terms of their reporting structure to know that, but that's typically how it would work.
Secretary Spikers?
No.
President.
I was under the impression that they would still need, I mean, as a public health entity, we would still need to meet and supervise how those tax dollars, and if there's any excess tax dollars, that we would be using those for community wellness, which is something that would, I don't know about anybody else, but I have a passion for that. So we would be able to decide where those funds go and what kind of activities or programs we want to support if we were to look to have extra funds. And we would have accountability for that.
So yes, and going back to this slide, this is basically the way it was characterized in Astria's proposal. And I think the devil's in the details of constructing exactly what that would look like.
CEO Parker?
Just a comment on that, and that is consistent with the model that we've talked about in a number of our workday sessions, which is where another public hospital district turned over the operation of their hospital, Stevens Hospital, to Swedish. And then they continued to operate, the district continues today. They rebranded themselves as Verdant. And Verdant is using tax revenue and then they do get a lease payment from Swedish for the use of wellness programs in that community. Now, I will say Verdant's deal back then is probably never going to be repeated in the country, but the structure of it is very similar to what we're talking about here, and that is the district would continue to have a significant role in the community with its wellness programs. And Commissioner Spikers has talked a bit about this, and that is using the relationships that can be developed with existing health and human service agencies in the community to leverage the work that they're doing. So that's a future vision that is being talked about here and that Verdant has done.
Yeah, I think CEO Parker just added additional information based on the other question. So with that, another question?
Well, it was stated that the organization, Astria, is accountable to the board and appointed secretary of the board. actually, in talking with Mr. Gallagher, he said that he's accountable to health tech, a management consulting firm, and that they can remove him, replace him at any time. And as you may know, there's the Baptist hospitals down in San Antonio had a management firm like that, Health Tech, different one. And Health Tech, the equivalent of Health Tech came in and replaced the CEO, the CFO, the COO, the CMO, the entire staff of their hospitals. And that can happen when you have a management firm that has that kind of control. So really, Mr. Gallagher reports to Health Tech in a sense, but I understand. Is that correct?
What we know about the relationship between Astria and Health Tech is what you have outlined in the report. And that is about all we know at the moment. So I would not feel comfortable answering that question more specifically. Most certainly, he has accountability to his board, regardless of the management agreement. Now, who would be the party actually making a decision to remove the CEO? I'm unclear based on the management agreement.
Thank you, Commissioner Aaron. Nothing further. Secretary Spikers. Further. Vice President Young, nothing further. President Miller.
Would you follow up on that and make sure the board gets the information that we find out? Because I think that's something we all want to know, is how that looks. Because if we think he's going to be there for a while and somebody else is going to come in and say, okay, you're not it, it's somebody else, that kind of affects how we decide. We want to know if there's a certain amount of stability.
Yeah, so one thing that is in your report is that the management agreement with Health Tech was previously in place with Sunnyside. So for as long as he's been a part of Sunnyside, and maybe even prior to that, he's had their confidence. So, I mean, we're at 5 years at this point, and but yes, we definitely need a lot more information about what that relationship looks like exactly.
You may recall that CEO Gallagher talked about providing a more robust organizational chart, because he admitted that we only have a couple of boxes on his chart, but he was willing to provide you additional information throughout the organizational chart, and that may help to see the reporting relationships.
That would be very helpful.
I did ask that question last night.
And I think that was Commissioner Aaron's question last night. CEO Park.
I'd like to know what your thoughts are on the obtaining of that kind of information. Wouldn't that be information that would probably only be available under a due diligence process post LOI?
I
guess it depends on that.
Yeah, I guess I would say I'm not sure. I mean, I think there's at this point, we have a fairly high degree of confidence that we've pushed about as hard as we can in terms of what John Gallagher and his team would be comfortable sharing with us, unless we move ahead.
Okay.
But sure, we could ask.
Mr. Paul.
Well, just a point of clarification, because I know that everybody's tired and we should move on. But I guess my point in asking the question is, if indeed Affiliation is more or less controlled and managed by a private or profit, by the way, management company, then indirectly so are we, and therefore we should consider, perhaps we should consider this in the past, ourselves entering into a contract with a management firm without having to do it through a third party. So that's why I'm concerned. I appreciate the efforts that are going to be made to get clarification. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything further then at this point?
Listen, I have one last question. I'm sorry.
Commissioner.
Health Tech is a management company. It's just like Marriott would manage many properties, but they don't own them.
Correct. And
So
there's
just
a
for
link.
clarification,
Yes,
isn't that
correct.
the way in the business world.
Correct. Astria is a
Astria is
not-for-profit
they
corporation.
hire the health tech to manage their properties.
Correct, and in your report, there is a link too, so you can click on
Just
that
for
and get a bit more
clarification.
information about
Thank
the
you.
company.
That, Madam President, looks like the last question is to this point in the presentation. Suggests that the consultants given the opportunity to move forward.
Yes,
I would suggest that we take a recess.
Okay, if we take a 15-minute recess, Joan needs to be out of here by 2, so that.
I don't know, I just need to be in.
10 after 2 for me.
I didn't
You realize this is.
Ten-minute recess.
Pardon?
10-minute recess.
Well, if we take a 10-minute recess, we're gonna lose.
No, I will stay till 10.
Okay, so let's take a very quick 5, not any longer,
That's fine.
and then we'll come back.
5 minutes.
And that'll give us about 15 more minutes. Councilman Hauser, do we go ahead and reconvene? Is that proper?
Yes, you took a recess, you're just reconvening at the appointed time.
It is now 1:53 and we are reconvening after a short recess.
Okay, so I want to remind you that we had 2 objectives at the beginning, and the first objective was to make a decision and get to a vote about whether or not you all are comfortable moving forward to the next phase in the process. The second objective was, depending on the outcome of that vote, we would talk about what the process would look like going forward. What I'd like to suggest is that if we do run out of time and lose a couple of commissioners, that we push if we can to get through the first decision point and perhaps pick up the second one. So hopefully we can get that far. The next phase in the process would be the drafting and executing of a letter of intent. What is a letter of intent? So a letter of intent is an exclusive agreement that summarizes the main points of a proposed transaction and confirms that the certain course of action is going to be taken. So this is a significant step. You are making a significant statement, and the asterisk there about exclusivity means that once you sign this letter of intent and move into the period of due diligence, that you are not engaging in discussions with other parties to try to sweeten your deal on the side. The intention is that you would be exclusively working through the process of due diligence, just you and Astria Health, no other parties involved. This is not a definitive contract, but like I said, it is a big step. The final agreement is subject to due diligence. Part of that due diligence we'll talk about in a moment has to do with the deeper level of data gathering and analysis and assessment that we all have acknowledged we need to do. But the other pieces of due diligence, there's a number of different legal hurdles that need to be met. There's also a certificate of need required. And the Federal Trade Commission has to go through a review. So there's other pieces in the due diligence beyond just everyone getting comfortable that we think a deal could come to pass. Things can happen in that process of due diligence, and things can come up that can be disruptive, and you wind up with no deal. However, this step, as I mentioned, is a significant step that you're making an intention to move forward and that you're going to be in exclusive due diligence with this one organization. Make sense?
Yes. Can we ask questions as we go along? It's rather cumbersome to wait till the end.
Well, there's 3 slides in this segment here.
I have a question about what you just said. And that is it necessary to have an exclusivity provision in a LOI? I have been advised by an attorney that the last thing you want to do at this stage is have an exclusivity provision.
I have never actually been involved in a transaction like this where the letter of intent was not an exclusive agreement between the two parties.
Legal counsel, can you address that?
Parties can enter into any kind of agreement they like, whether it be exclusive, inclusive, or allowing for other negotiations to occur. I think it would be typical, as some of your consultants identified, that the other party would want an exclusive LOI because they don't want you out also negotiating with another party at the time. But it would not have to be exclusive. There's no requirement to be exclusive. I doubt that Astria would be interested if it wasn't exclusive.
I can just confirm that. That is not. That we would not move forward if that was the
Could I add
intent.
something?
Are we done listening? Do you have anything else you want to say?
Well, I'd kind of like to get through the next couple of slides
Why don't we
because
allow her to do that?
Let me just clarify the concern, and that is there is definitely some interest out there by another, stronger, maybe closer organization to explore further with us, which we can do at this stage, but once an exclusivity agreement is entered into, they won't have anything to do with it.
Well, I think we already are under contract, and maybe I need help from, again, counsel, with a company to help us decide, and we have a contract with them to do what they're doing, correct?
I think, I'm sorry to interject, but I think Commissioner Pollard is referring to another healthcare organization that we're ready.
Yeah. So I have a slide on that as well. So there's literally 3 slides in this section. They all kind of flow together. If you'd allow me.
Answer your question.
But for the sake of disclosure, I believe if that's that entity that he is referring to, it could be the same entity that had received our RFP and was not interested.
All right, so with that, Madam President,
I just want to make it for the sake of
Commissioners,
disclosure.
please hold their questions until we can have complete these 3 slides, and then it'll be appropriate, we'll have more information. Some of your questions may be answered with this information. Sarah, if you might continue.
Okay. So this is the letter of intent. The other piece that happens here with the signing of a letter of intent is you move forward into a period of deeper due diligence. And as I mentioned previously, typically at this stage in the process, we would have done a little bit more diligence than we have been able to thus far due to the nature of the process. But moving forward with a letter of intent and deeper due diligence would really allow for that additional data gathering and assessment to occur. Just a quick definition so you understand what these terms mean. And it's the duty of an organization's directors and officers to act prudently in evaluating associated risks of a proposed transaction. And inside of that, the duty of each party to gather the necessary information on actual and potential risks of making that sort of an investment, and the duty of each party to confirm each other's expectations and understandings so that you ultimately can reach the terms of a definitive agreement. So that is the due diligence that would be conducted. And like I said, in addition to what we would like to know about them and what they would like to know about us, there's a list of legal and regulatory hurdles that would have to also be crossed. So the last slide here has to do with alternatives. So as Commissioner Pollard mentioned, there is the possibility of initiating discussions with other parties who initially intended to respond but actually did not submit a proposal. That's what I've called Plan B here. There is the possibility that we go back to the drawing board and issue a new RFP that would have a different set of parameters than those that were spelled out in the RFP that was issued. I'm calling that Plan C. There is the possibility, which Commissioner Pollard spoke of earlier, of the status quo, remaining independent, going it alone, and or, hire a management company, get into a management agreement with another organization. Those would be what I'm calling Plan D here. There are probably other permutations that I haven't thought of, which is why I have other question mark up there. What Steve and I would like to say to you is, this is your decision. We are not comfortable at this juncture telling you exactly what we think you should do. What we would like to remind you, however, is that you are at a juncture now that the significance of going down one of these other pathways is that you need to be ready to walk away from the proposal that's in front of you now. The second is that most certainly based on the feedback we received from those organizations that intended to respond but did not, is that you would need to revisit your goals of affiliation. Some of the things that were spelled out in those goals are things that clearly some of these other organizations were not ready to step up to. I would say the number one being the debt. And that brings me to number three. Probably just about any other type of a deal would be something that would be constructed in a different way and would most likely, it would be highly unlikely, I would say, based on the process we've just been through, to cover that debt service requirement. So those are the alternatives, and where we were going to go next would be, I assume, where there would be some formal discussion and questions that someone else would facilitate.
So the consultant's recommendation, Madam President, this time is that your commission have a motion as to what action they might want to take today. On that motion and seconding of it, then you can begin the discussion.
Do I hear any motion?
I make a motion that the board move forward to the next phase and then with further diligence study.
Is there any discussion?
I would just clarify that it's to move forward due diligence with Astria's response.
Yes,
With Astria's.
It's a draft.
it's a draft, yes.
So there
Just
has been a
draft,
motion
yes.
and a second,
Yes, there has.
and now you would ask for discussion.
I just did. Is there any discussion?
I would comment. Being on the finance committee and the treasurer for the last 4 years or so, looking at what the inevitability might be of using up cash, all of our cash eventually. We have to do something, it's clear. Whether this is right or wrong, I don't know. We won't know that yet. But unless you look behind the door, you're never going to find out what's behind it. So I would really like to move forward with that in mind to be very careful and make sure all of the commissioners use due diligence. Look at public records, talk to people. I think we've all been doing that. So I do want to see a draft and get this thing started. And I probably comment that if we're going to do something like this and we're going to have this exclusivity type of thing, that it be not that long. Either they're going to do it or not, either we're going to do it or not. And if we're not, let's get going on Plan B, which I've already mentioned several times, what might happen down the line, what else we really could do. The board would have to look at that, but I don't want to be sitting here for too long. And I'd rather go forward at this time and then keep an open mind. Be able to reject it if we want to. That's the option at this point. So.
Is there any other comments?
Drafting an executive letter of intent, execute a letter of intent, it does not necessarily mean it's embedded in stone, correct?
It's not the same thing as a definitive contract.
Okay, good.
And you have to get through both organizations' diligence and you have to get through those legal and regulatory hurdles before you can actually finalize.
With that in mind, this is putting us on that due diligence. That's when some of our questions that have not been answered they will be able to produce them, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
If I might, Commissioner, the phrase used previously by Sarah was an MOU. This is really a memorandum of understanding. A letter of intent is a little bit more foundational in the sense of what it's going to look like.
Yeah.
But really, you're agreeing to look behind each other's doors, if you will, to use Secretary Spiker's term.
This is going to be a memorandum of understanding.
A letter of intent is a form of a memorandum of understanding.
Right.
What if we called it a memo of understanding?
Well, it would
Because
not-
as soon as you use the word letter of intent, nobody else wants to touch it, regardless of the exclusivity clause.
Well, we could certainly look into calling it a memorandum of understanding, but the industry phrase and the approach is an LOI. It's a letter of intent, and I would think that Astria would want that, and I would probably advise you, and we'll use outside legal counsel who does affiliations. I think they'll want that phrase as well. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you.
Yes.
Commissioner Young, do you have anything to say?
Well, I'm just gonna say, when you look at a beautiful birthday cake, if you don't take a bite, you don't know how it's gonna taste.
Thank you.
That'll be the headline tomorrow.
Commissioner Pollard, do you have
That makes
anything?
me hungry and wanted to go over to the table. Yes, here's it, the way I see it, folks. Our due diligence as commissioners starts right now. And I believe that includes giving the public an opportunity to see these 88 slides that we were bombarded with last night, and the presentation, and these slides, and what the heck is going on before we take this precipitous action of drafting a letter of intent. Let's do our due diligence starting now by being transparent and informing the public of what the heck is going on. The earliest they can come out in the Valley Record is next week. Now, I'll save my comment, but remember, this proposal was 115 pages long. I've seen other affiliation proposals, never more than 30, 35 pages. And 88 slides, and we were inundated with so much material. We need time to digest it ourselves as well as make it available to the public that owns this hospital.
I'm gonna call for the question.
Calling for the question is to ask to close debate, and if there's no objection to calling that, debate would be closed. Otherwise, you could vote on whether to close debate. So the president may inquire, is there any further comments prior to closing the debate?
I just would like to make a comment. I believe many of the information or publications and everything that has been given out, or whether it's in public meetings or via the hospital's website, I think that's where also the public could get all the rest of it, especially those who doesn't appear or doesn't come to our meetings, which we really made every effort and every attempt to bring as many public citizens here. Unfortunately, we can't twist their arm, so just so for the sake of, releasing information, we do disclose this in our website as well.
President?
Can I respond?
I'm sorry.
Can I respond?
I think there's one more comment from Commissioner Pollard prior to
Okay, well, we have a
your asking
motion.
for a vote.
I appreciate what Commissioner Herron is saying, but the fact of the matter is we have 50,000 people in the hospital district. And if you add up all the public participation, partly due to faulty communication with the newspapers and other things, we probably had maybe a total of 15 or 20. I think last night, if you discount the proposers and the staff, there were like 3 or 4 people. Today, maybe 2 or 3 people that were not somehow connected. So the public really has not had a chance to look at this, regardless of the intentions, perhaps. And now is the chance to give them that opportunity, because this is a milestone when we start drafting the letter of intent. And let's first let it come out in the media and in other ways, so the public won't say later, like they said about the building of the hospital, you tricked us.
Thank you, Commissioner Pollard.
May I make just a real quick comment? I just want to say, I With the other public hospital districts that I've had the opportunity to work with, I actually have never been part of a process where we've been videotaped. And I don't know about any of you, but after every meeting, I go to Scott's blog site and I look at the postings and I read what's written, and I oftentimes watch the video because I want to see, oh God, how did I do? So, I mean, I think the information is out there pretty quickly, and it's one of the first things that shows up in a search. So,
Thank you for that input. Are we ready to vote? All those in favor to proceed with the letter of intent, say aye.
Could you clarify the actual motion?
I'll ask the clerk to read back the motion for the president at the request of Commissioner Paulus.
Commissioner Herron moved to move forward to the next phase with an LOI and due diligence with Astria.
With the drafting of the LOI, is that correct?
Drafting of the letter of the LOI.
I do believe that the words drafting.
Drafting, basically, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. All those in favor of moving forward with the drafting of the LOI, with the LOI, please, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No?
Okay, the ayes have it, and we have, I guess that's,
so
what next?
are you two needing to adjourn, or can we try to close the loop on the process?
I do need to get back to a court hearing, which I know I'm going to have to call the judge and tell him what to do. So,
Okay.
I move adjournment.
Oh, wait, no.
Okay.
How much more do you have?
How much more?
I mean, we probably could let Commissioner Spiker do.
Well, I mean, I think it would be material, but it is sort of material to the next step. So, Tom?
Given that we have urgency here to attend to other things, the next item is talking about how we get this work done, and I would propose that we bring that item to our board meeting, which is just next week.
Is there a motion to support that?
I make a motion to support that idea, and let's bring this to the next board meeting, which is on the second.
I second that as a way of, I second that as a way of finishing the report from Sarah Cage.
Will that work for you and Steve, Sarah?
Works for us.
Okay, we will vote. All those in favor say, I should ask, is there any other discussion?
And this vote is to bring this to the regular board meeting?
Yes, it is.
And just to clarify, another comment, this is the means by which this work is done.
Yeah, the second item on her.
Yes.
Right, and so I think just one last little bit of clarification. I'm just looking at my calendar to make sure that
You're available.
conflicts that evening. Yes, okay. So I just need to clarify that we likely won't be doing a whole lot between now and then in terms of moving forward on what you just voted on, because we do need to clarify and confirm the process and make sure that it's a process that Astria is comfortable with as well.
Thank you.
So do we vote?
Not yet.
All those in favor of the motion, say aye.
And once again, sorry, the motion is
To set over to your next regular scheduled board meeting on November 2nd, the further steps to be presented by the consultants in this matter.
thank you.
Okay, do we need to redo what we just did? All those in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Okay. All right. Everybody voted and it passes.
Thank you.
All right, do I hear a motion to dismiss?
Well, then I make a motion to adjourn.
I love that.
What is it?
How about motion?
Never heard of that.
Adjourn, vote to dismiss.
That occurs in school.
That, I feel like that.
President corrected herself.
All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Yep.
So that would mean we're going to recess.